I am delighted to welcome you all to the second installment of the 2019-2020 Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship. We have an overflow crowd, which is always a delight, but I'm not surprised you're all here to hear Professor Milliner. Now would be a good time to silence your cell phones. And I want to start the evening by introducing you to Walter Hansen, who made these lectures possible along with his lovely wife, Darlene Hansen. And they did so in honor of Walter's parents, Ken and Jean Hansen. So he is going to begin our evening with a few words and a prayer.
I didn't know when we set this up that I'd also get the joy of being able to say something at the beginning, and at first I said, no, I don't need to do that, but now I've gotten so used to it I can't turn it down. And I especially like the challenge of trying to figure out where Matt Milliner is going to be going with his most wonderful, weird combination of things of, Chicago and Chesterton and Native American. So I puzzled that out a little bit. Chicago is easy for me. That's my town. That's where I live. Sweet home Chicago. I play Blues Brothers, and I come back from anywhere because I was born there. As my father and grandfather. I won't go into that. But we live there and romance there, and enough of that. I love Chicago. And Chesterton loved Rome, so I understand that too. I'm reading a favorite quote that I trot out quite often about his love. Men did not love Rome because she was great. She was great because they had loved her. And that's how I feel about Chicago. I love Chicago. And he says as well, when you do love a thing, its gladness is a reason for loving it, and its sadness a reason for loving it more, which is also how I feel about Chicago, because I love it more when I'm part of the broken humanity there and being involved there. And to fit in the last piece of the puzzle, I only have personalized a Native American prayer. That's a very common prayer, "O Great Spirit" prayer, that I have used before in my time in Chicago. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds that blow off my lake and through my city, whose breath gives life to each person I see, open my eyes to see the beauty of your image in everyone. Open my ears to hear the voices of those crying for help. Open my hands to welcome and hold the lonely and poor. Open my mouth to speak words that heal the wounded. Fill my heart with the compassion of my brother, Savior, and Lord Jesus, in whose name I pray. Amen.
I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Crystal Downing, the co-director here at the Wade Center, along with my husband, who is just recuperating right now from 3 hours of emergency dental surgery. So he is sorry he can't be here because he knows what a spectacular evening this is going to be. Immediately after the lecture, some students are going to have to leave to go on to class, but I encourage all of the rest of you to stay for the question and answer time in order to be able to interact with a very important scholar who is doing important scholarship. Dr. Matthew Milliner is currently Associate Professor of Art History here at Wheaton, where he earned his BA in 1998. He went on to get a PhD in art history from Princeton University, where he also got an MDiv from the Theological Seminary. So that positions him perfectly to discuss the relationship between faith and scholarship and art that so informs the vision here at the Wade Center. We are especially delighted because he will continue to discuss, and you see some references here, one of the 7 Wade authors who doesn't get as much attention, G.K. Chesterton. And I'm so glad to draw that attention to him because both C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers credit Chesterton with shaping and sustaining their faith. I'll talk a little bit more about Sayers when I introduce the respondent to Professor Milliner's lecture. But for now, I want to share with you a few words from the inaugural lecture that C.S. Lewis delivered as the new chair of Medieval and Renaissance Lit at Cambridge University. And I want you to remember it as you listen to Professor Milliner's exploration of the artists who preceded Europeans by centuries in Chicagoland. Speaking to a crowded room of colleagues and students, like this room here tonight, C.S. Lewis said, and listen to this carefully, "If the Neanderthaler could talk, then should we not almost certainly learn from him some things which the best modern anthropologist could never have told us? He would tell us without knowing he was telling us. One thing I know," says Lewis, "I would give a great deal to hear any ancient Athenian talking about Greek tragedy. He would know in his bones so much that we seek in vain. At any moment, some chance phrase, I would add, chance image, might, unknown to him, show us where modern scholarship, or modern art, had been on the wrong track for years. Now Professor Milliner will help us get back, and I mean get back in more ways than one. He will help us get back on the right track." Professor Milliner.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. All right. Well, it's a beautiful night. Thank you for sharing it with David and me. We're really glad you're here. One of the many reasons why Chesterton remains relevant, fashionable, unignorable, even for those who don't share his faith, is that he was daring enough to cast a universal take on human culture from a Christian perspective. It's the kind of swagger to which most specialized academics today have an allergic reaction. To universalize is to totalize, to marginalize the other, and so we tend not to do it. Why have a grand survey class when you can specialize? And there is something to those critiques. It can be arrogant to try to see all of history in one grand sweep. But Chesterton's attempt to do so in The Everlasting Man, covered in the last lecture in this series, is itself a critique of one of those attempts. Chesterton brought a sacred missing theological dimension to H.G. Wells's naively progressive book, Outline of History. Chesterton kept the universal view, but put the suffering servant at the center. And we need Chesterton today, among many other reasons, because we have our own H.G. Wells grand sweeping views of history that either leave out the Christian faith or gut it. It doesn't matter if academics demur or cringe from such projects. The public longs for them anyway. And Chesterton's critique of Wells applies to many of these accounts as well. A sympathy with the small or the defeated as such, he tells us, with which we liberals and nationalists have been often reproached, is not a useless sentimentalism at all. It is the first law of practical courage. To be in the weakest camp is to be in the strongest school. This was developed long before Howard Zinn's People's History. Do not be afraid also of the word nationalist when it appears in Chesterton. This is humble nationalism aimed against its arrogant opposite, imperialism. And also understand that when Chesterton ends his critique of Wells, after insisting that the strong old literature is all in the praise of the weak, he concludes by citing the policy of Majuba. And that may not mean much to us today. Chesterton, though, is citing the 1881 Battle of Majuba Hill, an unexpected and devastating defeat by the British Army in the Boer War. Wells sided with the big British battalions. Chesterton was for the underdogs. Concluding an essay with the policy of Majuba would be like closing an essay today with the decisive defeat of American forces at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so to extend Chesterton's vision to Native American culture is not a quirky or exotic connection, but a natural one, even if it's the one that his most ardent fans might not be interested in making. And it's a connection that, I tried to show last time, he expressly stated he wished he had time to make. But there's another reason I pursued this perfectly natural connection between Chesterton and the Native American underdogs he would have championed, namely, Chesterton was a localist. He's the apostle not just of common sense, but of contentment, tutoring us in loving our own land, our own nation's own homes, food, families, friends. His novel, Man Alive, is a portrait of ecstatic gratitude for the commonplace. Hence, Chesterton constantly extols smallness and contentment and delight in little things. He wants us to love our homes, especially the small American homes he so admired, but without forgetting those whose hearthstones were taken from them. His first novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, 1904, is set in 1984. And yes, Eric Blair, a.k.a. George Orwell, may be nodding to Chesterton in his novel, 1984. Chesterton imagines a democracy drained of any meaning, run by a humorist, Oberon Quinn, elected by lot, randomly. The king, at random, who is, quote, a man whose soul has been emptied of all pleasures but folly. Quinn revives the medieval banners for the sport of it, but a local loyalist, Adam Wayne, takes this joke with deadly seriousness. Some have suggested that Chesterton's dystopian account predicted the Trump era. A leader who seems to run for fun, but then, to his surprise, is taken seriously by the masses. This is deliciously low-hanging interpretive fruit, and I'm going to resist it. Because I think a Native American reading of the Napoleon of Notting Hill is far more demonstrable and fits much more nicely in Chesterton's overall vision. In fact, at the start of the novel, a Native American character, the unseated president of Nicaragua, complains, quote, if the Bedouin Arab does not know how to read, some English missionary or schoolmaster must be sent to teach him to read. But no one ever says, this schoolmaster does not know how to ride a camel. Let us pay a Bedouin to teach him. It's the Chesterton people don't talk about. And later in the novel, when the young Adam Wayne begins to defend his territory valiantly from a road being constructed through it, we see why one astute critic suggested The Napoleon of Notting Hill was a novel for the era of Standing Rock. Adam, the localist, feels that Notting Hill, neighborhood of London, where he lives, is the heart of the universe, just as the Lakota knew the Black Hills are the heart of everything that is. Adam takes King Oberon Quinn's Charter of Cities with great seriousness. Meant as a joke, he takes it seriously, just as the Potawatomi took the Treaty of Chicago seriously, and therefore sued for the land that was not ceded in that treaty in red, the strip of debris from the Chicago fire. Of course, these lawsuits, seriously pursued by the Pokagon Potawatomi, failed. We Americans don't give up gold easily, especially not our Gold Coasts. But the point stands, and modern Potawatomi scholar John Lau has suggested this claim be reconsidered. In the Napoleon of Notting Hill, Adam Wayne is given a staggering sum of money to enable that highway to be built through his neighborhood, but Adam Wayne refuses the cash. The purchasers complain, quote, he pleads the inviolate sanctity of Notting Hill and calls it a holy mountain. And in the same way, the American government, after the Supreme Court finally acknowledged in 1980 that the Black Hills were indeed stolen, has tried to settle with the Lakota for its seizure of them. And like Adam Wayne, they won't take the cash. In short, when we read Chesterton's first novel as if it were a Western, many things fall into place. And I want to tell the story of Chicago in particular with this broad Native history in mind. And the fact that it's been called the cockpit of the continent assures that this will be of more than local interest. What's discernible here may, I expect, be discernible elsewhere. And my model is not the Napoleon of Notting Hill, but one of Chesterton's lesser-known books, The Resurrection of Rome. He wrote it after his visit there in 1930, and it's not his best book. It contains some unsavory aspects. To use Chesterton's aphoristic style against him, how I wish that instead of dismissing orthodox icons and cautiously admiring Mussolini, Chesterton would instead have dismissed Mussolini and cautiously admired icons. But Chesterton is perfectly right that while many know more details about Rome than he does, Chesterton gets its essence better than most. And what's the essence of Rome? Resurrection. Many in both Chesterton's day and ours accuse Christianity of being only a rehash of paganism. And this book is his response. Saying Christianity is refried paganism, he claims, is like complaining that science claims to be independent, but it really gets all its ideas from nature. It's a good line. Quote, "There is no question of the church disguising pagan ideas as Christian ideas, for there never was any disguise about the matter. Rome reveals an obvious and unconcealed continuity between the pagan and the Christian past. Still, if you had walked up to a pagan in the street and said," this is Chesterton, "Jupiter died for the love of you as though there were no other man alive, and every time you sin, you torture him anew," the pagan would have not the wildest notion of what you were talking about. Which is to say, Christianity added something clear and definite to what came before, that illuminated pagan culture retrospectively. As Chesterton puts it, quote, "The desire of all nations, the dreams of all religions, the imaginative craving that in some way something heroic might save the sufferings that are human, that indeed existed everywhere, and that was the need which the gospel was sent to supply. But the need was not the same as the supply," end quote. And this makes the Renaissance not a pagan revival, what Burckhardt or Nietzsche claimed it to be, but a Christian resurrection. The Renaissance was not a result of doubt, but rather of faith. Not a mere contempt for the past, but rather an invocation, a sort of wild veneration for the dead. Think of the grandfather of art history, Giorgio Vasari's frontispiece to the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. That shows painting, which I covered in the last lecture, and sculpture and architecture, which I'm covering in this one, rising from the dead. Recent Renaissance scholarship has largely vindicated Chesterton's view, showing the Renaissance to be largely a Christian movement that made use of the classical past. But why not extend the same treatment to our continent? Turtle Island, too, is experiencing a renaissance of indigenous culture, and it is equally misguided, I believe, to see it as merely pagan, even while some scholars of Native America, some white Christians, and some Native Americans themselves would prefer to see it that way. But just like scholarship in the Renaissance has vindicated Chesterton's contention that the Renaissance was Christian, so a dramatic turn in indigenous studies makes it clear that Christianity and Native America are braided together like sweetgrass. Chesterton's theology of perpetual resurrection is, quote, "the real clue about Rome." And it may be the real clue about Chicago as well. I wonder if while in Rome, Chesterton had the chance to see, among the sculptors he admired, the sculptures of Edmonia Lewis, the black Midwestern Catholic, who was also a member of a tribe connected to this land, the Ojibwa. Or maybe we can make the transition from Rome to Chicago by pointing to another resurrection about which Chesterton would have been unaware because he could not have been. When he visited Rome, the Borgia apartments would have still been concealed from view. They've since been restored. And the image of the resurrected Christ looks rather standard. The Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, is prominently depicted right there. He carved up the newly, quote-unquote, discovered continents in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Indeed, the Borgia papacy is one source for the infamous doctrine of discovery. Chesterton cleverly uses Borgia excesses to defend Catholicism. I think more interesting is that during the recent restoration of the Borgia apartments, the first known depiction of Native Americans by Europeans was uncovered just under the risen Jesus. Those closest to the glory of the risen Christ are the natives, and literally marginalized is the Borgia Pope. Powhatan's mantle in the heart of London, examined in the last lecture, seems to be telling us, hey, you came here, would you go back and attend to your own history? And this gives new meaning to Chesterton's remark, quote, I had always been puzzled about why all these good, healthy, innocent Americans bother so much with European travel at all. And so tonight we'll retell the history of our land, and in doing so, we'll need to think about it more widely. If I were to ask you how many archaeological sites survive in just northeastern Illinois alone, you're probably going to be surprised to realize the answer is not 5, not 50, not 500, but 5,500. If Clovis sites were previously thought to be the oldest human traces on this continent, we need to realize we've got pre-Clovis sites near us. Our mastodon, dating to 10,500 BC, shows no sign of having been butchered by humans, but this nearby mammoth, look at those V marks. It does have human marks on it. Human habitation of this land is ancient. And to fathom this, we've got to leave behind the petty squabbles between suburb and city, because we are all part of a much larger pattern of settlement here. And in this broad retelling of Chicago land, I won't contribute to the debate about whether or not a new star should be added to the flag. I'm just going to redefine the stars altogether. Instead of Fort Dearborn, the World's Columbian Exposition, the Century of Progress Expo, we'll just go with a complete rewriting, starting with the mounds. Now, we could begin with this famous early view of Chicago before it became the city it is, the site of Fort Dearborn. But why settle for that reconstruction when we can get something really close nearby? To the distant north is the angular, imposing steeple of Wheaton Bible Church. To the west is the imperious tower of Fermilab guarding its unnaturally circular particle accelerator. This is a view from the hospital. And between these two children of modernity lie one of her orphans. Look at the similarity. Through the bare January trees, one can see what's left of a winding river that drew inhabitants to this area so long ago, as evidenced by 3 mounds that rise delicately from the earth, Indian burials. You can't quite see them from that hospital room, but they're there. And when I was looking at them 5 years ago, I could turn to see a different mound, or what was left of it, lending a gentle slope to the sheets that covered my sleeping wife. And that mound's one-time resident, my newborn son, laid in intensive care 3 floors below, where the flicker of his premature life was being blown into flame by the skilled sentinels of the night shift. What could be more natural than seeing a womb and an Indian burial mound in the same terms? Curiously wrought in the depths of the earth, cries the psalmist, speaking of his own uterine life. David's relating the womb to the earth makes each human life as much a direct product of divine artistry as was Adam and Eve. hand wrought by God from the dust of the ground. And the Bible uses earth and womb imagery to describe resurrection as well. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise, writes Isaiah. The earth will give birth to the dead. And that is what makes her, the earth, pregnant now, gravid with bodies awaiting the resurrection. Countless mounds like the ones near us speckled the land we called the Midwest. Estimates are up to 1 million, mostly destroyed by farmers, vandals, or archaeologists. Like the Great Pyramids of Egypt, which our Midwestern mounds predate. And like the burial mounds of Chinese emperors that we traveled to see, these monuments are, or in this case were, testimony to collective humanity's insistence that death is not the end. Following vandalism in the 1920s and University of Chicago excavations in the 1930s, Wheaton College enacted a salvage operation at the Winfield Mounds in 1975 and 76, attempting to protect and catalog what was left of them. The latest thesis on our area mounds by Peter Geraci not only more firmly dates them to the Middle Woodland period, that is 250 AD to 1000 AD with repeated settlements, but it evokes the cultural and spiritual importance of the sites and their springs as well. Geraci's thesis gestures towards something above the archaeologist's pay grade. He evokes sacred space. And this should feel right to us because the doctrine of the resurrection alone should have kept us from disturbing those monuments if only we had believed it. I know that the Indians here could not have been Christian, but the church father Gregory of Nyssa, who lived at the same time as this settlement, said this, quote, "Those outside our philosophy, by various assumptions in different ways, have partly attained to the doctrine of the resurrection," end quote. And the Psalter's more direct. To him all who sleep in the earth bow down in worship. But rather than making that connection, these mounds are now named after a man of undeniable military distinction, Old Fuss and Feathers, General Scott. Now his record's impressive. He avoided much bloodshed in Mexico. He trained Civil War generals. But he also supervised Cherokee removal. And his strangely upbeat account of that infamous journey, related in the third person, as is always the case with Scott, so as to be able to confer praise upon himself, makes the Trail of Tears sound more like the Trail of Cheers. Quote, "He has reason to believe that on the whole, their condition has been improved by transportation," end quote. May the Lord have mercy on General Winfield Scott. And please have the same on me if you begrudge my referring to the mounds as what the Illinois Archaeological Survey calls them, DU-33, due page 33rd site cataloged. And I'll be thinking not of Scott, but of the traditional 33 years of our Lord instead. DU-33 is nestled within the Hopewell interaction sphere and the Havana-Hopewell complex within that. This was a network of trade that connected massive swaths of North America east of the Rockies. Now, the objects found in DU-33 are not terribly impressive, nor are the objects in my home. But other Hopewell mound burial sites include richly elaborate pottery, sculpture, statuary, animal pipes, grizzly bear teeth, shells, and obsidian, a continental collage. In Ohio, the earthworks made contemporary to DU-33 comprise the largest earthen enclosures in the country? No. The continent? No. The hemisphere? No. The largest in the world? Yes. And what was the theme that summarized these Hopewell mounds and the sculptures and offerings within them? Again, archaeologists, not theologians, archaeologists say this, quote, "The rebirth and renewal of the world and all its living things." As corn moved north and became a staple of this area, mounds became more, shall we say, playful. Effigy mounds, many of them in the delightful shapes of animals, have been documented in Aurora, in Kane County, along the Fox River. In one case, they depicted the birds flying south. They were, quote, built to symbolize and ritually maintain balance and harmony with the natural world and within the context of ceremonies of renewal and rebirth. One site on the Mississippi has 894 of them. And I suggest that to bring this culture to the forefront of our consciousness, we think of the throwing motion made by pitchers today, similar to hurling the ancient atlatls. Now, attached to those atlatls for extra thrust were these bird stones made at the time of Moses and David, which are easily as impressive as Brancusi's bird that stands in the Art Institute of Chicago today, our Midwestern abstraction. I also evoke the Wrigley Mound because near it there was an effigy mound. It was a lizard or a serpent, and for a Christian perspective on that motif, I refer you to the previous lecture. Chicago's lizard mound, though, near a Potawatomi burial site, was destroyed to make room for the L train. And then, after the effigy mound culture came, there's the lizard mound, came the aggression of settlement, those menacing modern street grids. You've seen those Illinois grids, haven't you, from the sky? Isn't it awful what settlement did? I'm tricking you. That's Chicago. That's Cahokia, an archaeologist's grid of it. The greatest mound city located far to the south near what is now St. Louis. The Corn Kingdom of Cahokia emerged at the beginning of the second millennium, a magnificent gridded network in line with the stars, moon, and sun, magnificent and merciless, at least if you were among those ritually sacrificed at Mound 72. These were public performances of people being clubbed to death, 4 at a time at first, then 7. On another occasion, 19 people were publicly, ritually murdered, then 24, 39, 53 at a time. And yes, Cahokia colonized. Scholars call it the militaristic imaginary of Cahokia, expanding at the expense of others, maybe even at the expense of the effigy mound cultures. And finally, as is well known, after exploiting both people and land, elitist Cahokia collapsed on its own before any European settler arrived on the scene. And so, first thing to say when retelling the history of Chicago is, yes, the mounds were symbols of hope, Chesterton's Rome awaiting Christianity. And yes, they were monuments to human sacrifice, Chesterton's Carthage with its sacrifices to Baal. And so if in our parallel flag we've complimented the settlement of Fort Dearborn by reminding ourselves of the settlement that came before it, we can now move to supplementing the Great Fire of Chicago with a more extensive catastrophe, Indian removal. At the time of American settlement, the area we now know as Chicagoland was comprised of, quote, networks of family, trade, tribe, and visions of the future, end quote. Resources, not real estate, is the key to understanding these complex networks. The effigy mound building societies were long gone, though the Ho-Chunk, formerly known as Winnebago, claimed to be their descendants, and they're located to the north of us. To the west were the Sauk and Fox, and a useful key to understanding the tribes of this area in particular is the family commonly known as the Anishinaabe, comprising the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwa Indians. This was primarily Potawatomi, a tribe which controlled 18 million acres in a wide band running all the way to Detroit across Lake Michigan and Milwaukee as well. They were themselves refugees, having been pushed westward from the St. Lawrence River area to what is now Lake Michigan from the expanding Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, who partnered with the Dutch and British in the fur trade. And as we saw last time, tribes like the Shawnee and Delaware were pushed into this area by American expansion westward, adding to the mix. All in all, the estimated population of Indians in this area, about 30,000, a figure doubled across the Great Lakes more broadly. And the relationships are well communicated by maps, not just this one, but this one too. Overpainted by area native artist Chris Papin. The funhouse faces reflect our distorted settler views of the original residents of this land. The painting's entitled The Fox Delegation, signifying both a delegation of representatives and their inevitable delegation of land. And you can see Winfield and Wheaton on the map. You might say, okay, but come on, how were settlers and natives going to share this land? That's not a mystery. A series of ugly frontier conflicts culminated in the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers, an American victory. And then a covenant of sorts was struck between the American government and the Indians of what we now know as the Midwest. This is the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, signed by 23 Potawatomi, who generally got a good deal. They gave up some small tracts of land, including 6 miles square at the mouth of the Chicago River, in exchange for annuities. And it was sealed with wampum, a wampum belt that is still on display at Fort Meigs in Ohio. So if you're a resident of this area, a guest in the land that was not originally yours or mine, fear not. You're looking at the contract that makes shared residence here permissible. The intention of both parties in this contract, or maybe we should call it a covenant, was to, quote, live together in the future as friends and brothers, end quote. Then Jefferson negotiated for land not included in the 1795 treaty. A younger generation of Potawatomi did not benefit from the arrangement. They were enraged. And Jefferson's behavior caused those who did sign the Greenville Treaty to feel betrayed as well. This series of deteriorating relationships led to the Treaty of Fort Wayne, where some Indians signed away land that wasn't theirs to give away, to gain annuities, and the time of covenant and cooperation was passing. The Confederacy of the Betrayed organized under the charismatic leadership of Tecumseh and his younger brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa. And while Tecumseh was gathering forces, Tenskwatawa attacked William Henry Harrison's troops, and the Indian Confederacy was defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. The next year, the Potawatomi attacked the Fort Dearborn settlers in Chicago. Now, we might cast these accounts as pagan resistance against Christian settlers, as they've been continually portrayed. The Michigan Avenue Bridge still calls them martyrs, which they may have been. But that's not how Tecumseh describes the religious dynamics at work. And these are the words that are placed in several accounts on his lips during his negotiation with William Henry Harrison. How can we have confidence in the white people? When Jesus Christ came upon the earth, you killed him and nailed him on a cross. You thought he was dead. You were mistaken. Now, I know that's a trope that's used in lots of native literature, but isn't it interesting that the accusation so many Europeans traditionally directed at Jews that they killed Christ is for Tecumseh directed at Europeans instead, including us? Sell a country, said Tecumseh in the same speech. Why not sell the air, the great sea, the earth? But no one can keep Americans from selling, and it was time to sell. In 1829, the Second Treaty of Prairie du Chien, at the epicenter of the effigy mound culture, the land we are now on, Tract 148, was given up by a delegation of Anishinaabe. The terms of Greenville had receded. But again, not all agreed. Would you have agreed if this was happening to your land? A Sauk warrior who had fought alongside Tecumseh led the last resistance we know as the Black Hawk War. President Andrew Jackson was in a battle over the bank of the United States with his rival Henry Clay. It's ironic that we put his name on his face on the $20 bill. He hated printed money. So Jackson demands the war ends quickly, and he orders Winfield Scott to take command. The Black Hawk War marked the beginning of the U.S. policy of, quote, stripping tribes of their land bases and their culture, economic, and political independence as well. And this war was brutal. A young Abraham Lincoln is said to have buried some scalped soldiers. There were scalps on both sides. After repeated attempts at Black Hawk and his tribe to surrender, it ended in massacre. The Sauk were cut down in the Mississippi after Black Hawk, leading a band comprised also of women and children, attempted to surrender twice. Black Hawk survived the struggle thanks to a young Sauk warrior who, tired of fighting, received the peace pipe on his behalf. Black Hawk is given a tour of the nation, meets Jackson himself, and faced with the enormity of European influx in his visits to Baltimore and Philadelphia, where he was received like a celebrity, Black Hawk agreed to peace. But he also said in his autobiography that he was, quote, very much afraid that in a few years they will begin to drive and abuse our people, as they have formerly done. I may not live to see it, but I feel certain that the day is not distant, end quote. And distant it was not. As Black Hawk's autobiography was published, the 1833 Treaty of Chicago was sealed, in which remaining natives brokered the best arrangements for themselves under the circumstances, and in 1838, the Indian removal policy, that is, the ethnic cleansing policy, became national policy. And that's the same year that Jesse Wheaton built his home. How does this land tell that story that I just told you? That's how. All the events just related, the battles with the Tecumseh Confederacy and with Black Hawk, are marked in our land by obelisks of triumph. One in Indianapolis proclaims Harrison the conqueror of the Indian Confederacy. And so we go from covenant to conquest. As one of these obelisks claims, what makes land more sacred is the participation of presidents. That may be so. But the death of the saints, I believe, also makes places holy. And the closest we can get to that in these conflicts is from the removal of those who, after mediating between settlers and Black Hawk unsuccessfully, were forced to depart. And when we follow the trail to where we dumped these Christian Potawatomi at the Sugar Creek Mission in Kansas, we don't find obelisks, we find crosses. Every name of those who were brought there to die, lovingly spelled out. While in Rome, Chesterton marveled at the Egyptian obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo, once dedicated to the Egyptian sun god by Ramses II, who went up against Moses, and Augustus, then dedicated it to the sun god of the Latins, Apollo. Quite an obelisk. Quote, this stone, Chesterton says, once dedicated to two sun gods, now stands in a light that is brighter than 20 suns, end quote. Representing that light is the cross on top. Chesterton says, it's as if the cross is saying to the imagery below, that'll keep you quiet. Unlike Rome, our Midwestern obelisks of triumph and our crosses are separated by thousands of miles because of the forced evictions. And maybe it's the job of 21st century Christian Midwestern imagination to, without forgetting the suffering of the settlers as well, put the crosses on top. Now, there was an obelisk at the event represented by our third star, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, celebrating 1 year late the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival on these shores. And at that event, one Potawatomi Indian, whose band had managed to broker an agreement to stay, was given the chance to speak. Pokagon's speech, defiantly printed on birch bark, is itself a protest against the lack of Native inclusion in the opening ceremonies of the fair. This part is frequently cited, quote, and while your hearts in admiration rejoice over the beauty and grandeur of this young republic, and you say, behold the wonders wrought by our children in this foreign land, do not forget that this success has been at the sacrifice of our homes and a once happy race. End quote. That's the cost of Chicago. Simon Pokagon foretells an environmental degradation that few today would dispute. His speech has been discussed at length as an act of political resistance to American racism at the fair, where Indians were deliberately depicted as savages. But there's a reason Pokagon's speech, when featured, for example, recently at the Chicago Architectural Biennial, isn't quoted in its entirety. Because it also says this: to be just, we must acknowledge that there were some good men with these strangers who gave their lives for ours, and in great kindness taught us the revealed will of the great Spirit through his Son Jesus, the mediator between God and man. But while we were taught to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves, and our children were taught to lisp, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, bad men of the same race, whom we thought of the same belief, shocked our faith in the revealed will of the Father as they came among us with bitter oaths upon their lips, something we had never heard before, and cups of fire water in their hands, something we had never seen before. And Pokagon also appeals to God's judgment, that day when the drum will beat. And God opens his mouth to settlers and says, I gave my only Son, who declared unto you my will. And God's judgment pours. I find you guilty of following the trail of Christian missionaries into the wilderness among the natives, and when they had set up my altars, and the great work of redemption had just begun, and some in faith believed, you then and there most wickedly set up that idol, the idol of taverns. So perhaps we need not ask, as the famous 1894 novel did, what would Christ say or do if he came to Chicago? In the year before, through his servant Simon Pokagon, Christ did come to Chicago. There are remarkable parallels between Pokagon's critique of Chicago's Gatling gun culture and its skyscrapers. And Chesterton's critique sounds very similar, even if Chesterton was considerably more lenient toward alcohol. Quote, men discovered, this is Chesterton, that they could build skyscrapers at the same moment as they discovered there was no such thing as the sky. He perfectly captures modernity's arrogance there in a phrase. But Pokagon knows the sky is still there and that our skyscrapers don't actually scrape it. Quote from Pokagon, all our fathers once loved to gaze upon was destroyed, defaced, and marred, except the sun, moon, and starry skies above, which the Great Spirit in his wisdom hung beyond their reach. If Chesterton and Pokagon are right, perhaps Chicago doesn't have to keep up with Dubai. And maybe our failed skyscrapers are the most interesting of all, or the ones that warn us of our own ambitions, or the more modest ones like the Marquette Building and the Stock Exchange, which so beautifully and with undeniable equality memorialize the Indians that we removed. Or maybe we need to see these monuments humbled. Perhaps the John Hancock Center is really only fulfilled by the humble fountain next to it. Ralph Adams Cram's citation that the glory of the Lord shall cover the earth as the water covers the sea at Fourth Pres. Or, even more severe, at Procopius Abbey, where the tough beauty of the Hancock Center seems to be getting a rest. Or maybe we need to look, that's the side of the building there. Or maybe we need to look beyond Chicago, realizing that the Forest County Potawatomi near Honey Rock, well, they've revived the Thunderbird earthworks in the form of a planned school building. The Oneida, a branch of the Haudenosaunee that were removed to Wisconsin, are no different. I wish Jeannie Gang and her Vista Tower all success in the world. But it's equally exciting to see the turtle effigy mounds in the form of an elementary school rising from the dead. This is no billionaire's abode. Instead, it's where once suppressed native languages are taught, by tribal elders in the very heart of the turtle. Chicago awarded itself another star at the 1933 World's Fair, whose motto was, it stirs the blood, get ready, science finds, industry applies, man conforms. Woo! Oh yeah! Despite protests, the gift given to Chicago by Mussolini, in conjunction with the fair celebrating the fascist era, it still stands. Chicago liked Mussolini too. But let's look past Mussolini's fascist pediment and realize that the original column is originally from Ostia, where Augustine and Monica had their vision together in Confessions 9. Augustine's, not Mussolini's, wisdom is what leads us to our last star, thanks to a boy who was 5 years old when the 1933 fair took place. From the earliest youth, there's the protests and there's the fascist inscription there at the monument, right by Soldier Field. From the earliest youth, Peter Powell studied the history and the ceremonies of the Plains Indians. In fact, studying Indian culture, he told me, is what caused him to want to become a Christian priest. And just as he was set to serve beyond Chicago, he came to realize that the entirety of Native America was coming to him because of American attempts to urbanize Indians in the 1950s. And so, as an Episcopal, now Anglican priest, he founded the St. Augustine Indian Center. St. Augustine, after all, knew what so many Chicagoans have forgotten. Here's a quote from Augustine's retractions. "For what is now called the Christian religion existed even among the ancients and was not lacking from the beginning of the human race." Father Powell, now 91, is both an honorary Cheyenne chief and an Anglican priest. How is that possible? To cite his own words, quote, "Christ came as the perfecter, the fulfiller of all the world's cultures and traditions. The church holds that the finest in the pre-Christian religions reflected the eternal truth and beauty of God. Thus, these religions were, in their way, preparations for God's revelation of himself in human flesh as Jesus Christ." What was said by Powell in Chicago is exactly what was said by Chesterton in Rome. Powell criticized the Bureau of Indian Affairs and attacked the Chicago school system for teaching a false history that ignored the dignity and courage of American Indians. He ably fundraised and partnered with Mayor Daley for urban Indian relief. And he did not maintain control. For Powell, as one scholar puts it, letting go was a form of activism. His entire board of directors consisted of American Indians, and in 1971 he resigned as director to make way for an Indian to take his place. But Powell continued his role as spiritual director of the program, which he assiduously kept separate from social services to ensure more funding. The American Colonel Mackenzie's soldiers had destroyed the Northern Cheyenne wealth and material beauty. And so Father Peter Powell had it recreated. He commissioned a Cheyenne sculptor, Dick West, to create a Christ that conveyed both the suffering and beauty of the Cheyenne. On my trip to visit him, he lives not far from the destroyed lizard mounds, Father Powell tenderly held the Cheyenne Christ, which is right behind him, as if it was the Christ child himself. Indeed, he referred to the sculpture as Christ. And this struck me as less the confusion of idolatry than the effect of countless prayers from all this continent's nations gathered in Chicago to worship Christ. Daily Mass in front of a sculpture for over 55 years has made it something much more than art. But lest that is his home, lest we think that the era of colonialism has concluded, it's notable that the St. Augustine Indian Center is in Father Powell's living room because it no longer exists. Now, Father Powell will tell us that that is a product of success. They worked themselves out of a job. But it also might be because of gentrification. Many Indians can no longer afford to live in uptown. And that's at least what the senior Native Americans gathered at Chicago's Kateri Center have suggested to me. And so it's tempting to shift the narrative to relatively more affordable places like Wheaton. After all, at least our mounds survive. Wheaton professor Sarah Stanley has uncovered a 1921 document in Charles Blanchard's papers that referred to this campus as Old Indian Hill. And we have to prayerfully ponder what it means to own part of the sacred mountain out west. But our Christian faith enables this conversation to continue. To give a sense of the progress, here is Casey Church, a descendant of Simon Pokagon, teaching and leading Wheaton's first powwow, so lovingly organized by Gene Green. Now, yes, the menacing grids of the Great Plain of Chicago cut through this city, whether Geneva or Roosevelt. And there is a way of interpreting Wheaton as an unqualified endorsement of this American vision. But another way is to see Wheaton as a dip below the grid. After all, when the Wheaton brothers gave this land for the railroad, the pure path westward was disrupted. Scholars tell us that the human sacrifices at Cahokia were in line with the sun, and they had a purpose. They, quote, unified diverse peoples and the forces of nature into one place, one body politic, end quote. And there's a human sacrifice here as well, also perfectly in line with the sun, making us one body as well. I'm referring, of course, to Professor Hooker's corpus, as beautiful as the Cheyenne Christ, which is lit up on the mornings of the equinox. Finally, Chesterton concludes the resurrection of Rome with a meditation on the Church of San Clemente, built atop a pagan Mithraeum. But as some of you will know, one can have that experience in Chicago as well. St. Clement's Church in the Lincoln Park neighborhood was inspired by San Clemente. And you can also have that experience in Wheaton, not far from DU 33. Maybe Joel Sheasley's choice of elevation is intended to evoke the mounds, which were deliberately built near life-giving spring water associated with rebirth. This, of course, is All Souls Church. That's a rebirth that we know as baptism, which is to say what Chesterton said of Greek paganism applies to the sacred mounds, springs, and stories of this land too. Here's his quote: "We have entered more deeply than they into the Eleusinian mysteries and have passed a higher grade, where gate within gate guarded the wisdom of Orpheus. We know the meaning of all the myths. We know the last secret revealed to the perfect initiate." As a Protestant reader of Chesterton, I believe that secret to be this: the grace of Christ, applicable to all epochs, could be mysteriously extended not to the righteous, but to sinners. Perhaps even the feather-clad human sacrificing priests of Cahokia, even to old Fuss and Feathers himself, and even to those who, still benefiting from the American policy of conquest and removal, live here today. Thank you.
Wow. And we are ready for even more wonder. I am honored to introduce our respondent tonight. the incredibly talented David Hooker. With a BA in English, yay, from Furman University and an MFA in ceramics from Kent State, Professor Hooker radiates the breadth of his background in his role as professor of art at Wheaton College. Not only does he introduce students to the Trinitarian theory of creativity proposed by Dorothy L. Sayers in The Mind of the Maker, but he also successfully teaches students how to practice creativity, how to make new things, and in the process, make things new. I have no doubt, and I've written a lot about Sayers, I have no doubt that Dorothy Sayers would love Professor Hooker. And he is perfectly suited to deliver a response tonight, as made evident in the words of his online biography. And think of the applicability to what this brilliant lecture we just heard from Professor Milliner. Professor Hooker's artistic practice explores the inherent value of materials, objects, and places, hoping to find ways to better connect and understand the world we live in. A world, I would add after listening to Professor Milliner, that needs to better understand the materials, objects, and places of those who lived in the same world centuries before us. Professor Hooker.
Crystal, thank you so much. I really relish the idea that Dorothy Sayers might have liked me at all. Can you hear me okay? Just checking. I didn't actually do a mic check before, so just wanted to make sure. Okay. So I have the somewhat unenviable task of following a lecture by Dr. Milliner. In some ways, that is the kind of thing that wakes me up in a cold sweat. One of the problems about following Dr. Milliner is that there's so much stuff in his lecture that a response could be another lecture. I'm going to do my best not to do that. So after writing, I was just talking to Matt and saying, I wrote 8 pages, then scrapped it, then wrote 14 pages, then scrapped it at 9 o'clock this morning and wrote 5. So I'll try to get us to a point where we can shift around and get more comfortable and have questions. So I'm going to try to do my best to limit myself to ways in which my artistic practice, which Crystal just alluded to, specifically explorations in pottery and sculpture, relate to 2 key themes I found in Dr. Milliner's talk. One is finding ways to fully connect to our specific place, which includes recognizing the significance of its history and resisting the complacency of forgetting. I'm going to come back to this. So, yes, no, yes. All right. Before I begin talking about the mounds, though, I want to talk about pottery. Of course I do. For me, pretty much everything starts with pottery. Roughly 35 miles from the place I grew up in North Carolina, is the home of one of the oldest living ceramic traditions on the continent, the Catawba Indian Nation. Here, the pottery tradition has continued unbroken for a staggering 4,000 years, although the thread of that tradition has nearly broken twice this century. The knowledge of how to dig the clay, how to prepare it, work the forms, and how to fire it properly has been passed down from generation to generation all that time. This often happens in families like the Robbins family, Here you can see 3 generations of Robbins family potters. I was able to meet and spend some time with Margaret Robbins, so that's my connection. The clay that is the heart of the tradition doesn't come from a store. Rather, it is dug from the ground by hand. The Catawba are insistent on that point. They will only use the clay from the traditional field that was used by their ancestors. That is to say, they have been mining clay from the same field for at least 2,000 years. Try to wrap your mind around those numbers. A 4,000-year-old living tradition getting its clay from the same small piece of land for nearly 2,000 years. It is beyond my imagining. The Catawba and the work they put into making pottery redefine my understanding of what it means to be connected to place. When we think of pottery, or we see pottery in museums, we often think about the forms or the surface decorations, the imagery, and how they tell us something about the culture. Very few of us think about the material, the clay itself, and how it is part of the story. It is, in fact, the beginning of the story. For the Catawba, it is a way of declaring their connection to their ancestors and to their land. We have largely lost that understanding in our industrialized world, where clays are mined, refined, and mixed together to make them more standardized. But it is still possible to dig your own clay, discover its special characteristics, and allow those characteristics to be part of your work. That is something I did when I lived in the Carolinas, but I hadn't done it here in Illinois until fairly recently. It was actually time spent in an artist residency in China that inspired me to look for sources of local clay when I returned. You can see the results in these pots. While the clay body is still a commercial product, the glazes that are made large part from locally dug clays. So the vase on the left is made with what I'm calling Wheaton wild clay, which was actually taken when the foundation for the new conservatory building was dug. And the faceted cups have what my students have declared honey's in slip, honey rock, and bazin. And so that it was actually dug up from foundations when they were building cabins up in Honey Rock. In this way, by using these materials, the work becomes much more significantly about place. The moon jar is a reflection of the specificity of Wheaton, as the cups are a reflection of the specificity of Honey Rock. I think of Native American mounds in much the same way. Each one is a unique expression of culture because each one is connected to a place. The Winfield mounds, or the DU-33, do I have that right? Mounds, are unique not because of anything they may or may not have had in them. The Winfield mounds are unique because they are in Winfield, made with Winfield soil, by people who lived in what I call Winfield. My wife, Elaine, and I have visited many different Native American mounds during our marriage, a practice that started when we lived in Ohio while I was finishing up graduate school. They can be found all over the country, not just here in the Midwest. We have also visited them in South Carolina and Florida. Sometimes the mounds are part of large national parks like these are. Sometimes they are only spots on a map with an overgrown, forgotten trail one has to navigate to get there. The contrast between those two experiences is sometimes very striking. But I actually enjoy seeing the mounds both ways. The sites to me are sacred, acknowledged or not, protected or not. They speak of a people's connection to land, to place, to earth. I connect to them through that same material. There is a sacredness in the ordinary. When we moved here, I was really excited to discover that there were mounds in Winfield, the town where we have lived since moving to the area. But even as I celebrate the mounds, I have to acknowledge the more troubling history that is also part of their story. They were excavated, I would say desecrated, which I know of nothing that could be done to fix that. But they have also been named by the name of the town, which takes its name, as we'd mentioned, from General Winfield Scott, who oversaw the Trail of Tears, and that is a travesty. The name of the mounds could and should be officially changed. This work of art, called Eisenstieg, roughly translated iron rail, is by the German artist Anselm Kiefer, contemporary artist Anselm Kiefer. In much of his work, he has confronted Germany with its own past, not allowing them to forget the atrocities that took place under the Third Reich. In this way, he serves much the same role as many Old Testament prophets. This is important and difficult work. At a time when Germany was rebuilding and wanting to leave the past behind, his work was a reminder that there is no moving forward without acknowledging the past. Complacency is not an option. In the 80s, Kiefer painted massive historic scale landscapes like this one. The landscapes are indistinct, often somewhat abstracted, but they all have a kind of post-apocalyptic feel that evoke bombed-out buildings, strewn rubble, or desolate fields. In this one, railroad tracks slice the land in half, leading to where? Exactly. Is this a train leading out of this bleak landscape or into it? A train leading to a new beginning or to Auschwitz? While I do not pretend to try to make artwork that speaks to or for my generation, I felt in Kiefer an opportunity to make some work that might help me connect to my own place and its history. One of these works is the Service Project, which explores my connection to the Winfield Mounds. For this work, yes, it's going to work. For this work, I filmed a series of performances, one for each season of the year, in which I served tennis balls slowly and methodically at Winfield Mounds Forest Preserve for an extended period of time, usually 1 to 2 hours. I won't make you watch 1 to 2 hours of video. This is very short. Edited. I chose tennis for a number of reasons. I played tennis competitively as a junior and still enjoy playing tennis today. Tennis has consistently been a part of my life. It is a generational sport in my family, handed down from my father to me and my brothers and to some of our children. There is also a ritualistic action in playing tennis, especially practicing, which consists of hitting the ball over and over again to build muscle, in the same way, to build muscle memory. In the service motion, that ritual action is subtly emphasized. There is a moment just after the ball toss when my arms are raised in a gesture reminiscent of an orant pose, a gesture of prayer. But I also recognize that tennis is a sport, like my ritual, that is fraught with tension. It is an elitist sport played mostly by the upper classes. As such, it is a sport which calls in question the distribution and use of economic and environmental resources. By hitting serves at the mounds, I hope to find a way to personally connect with the space, to feel it viscerally, to make it part of my muscle memory, and to call attention to the mounds, but also to acknowledge the tension related to their history through my ritualistic action. Like Dr. Milliner, I too want to encourage us to connect to the history of this place. And we need to recognize it as place, not space, as defined by the quotation from Walter Brueggemann. We are not free from place. Place gives us identity, but it also requires commitment. Wheaton is generally pretty good about acknowledging its history. I dare say most of us in this room are aware of and celebrate the fact that Wheaton College was once an active part of the Underground Railroad. We have the bones of a mastodon that was discovered in Glen Ellen on display in the Myers Science Center. The DuPage County History Museum is mere blocks from here in downtown Wheaton. The Winfield Mounds, or what's left of them, remain part of a protected forest preserve. These are spaces we have set apart in which to celebrate our past. But by setting these spaces apart, we are also able to set them aside. We are not so comfortable allowing the history of this place to ask something of us. We do not always let our sense of history affect our daily lives. It is easy to become complacent about the past, or to give in to the tyranny of the now, or to place all our hopes on the future. But I think a right orientation to the past should permeate our understanding of the present and help shape our future. This, I believe, is part of what it means to seek the wisdom of God. As Christians, we are tasked with participating in the new creation, but we need to remember that the new creation springs out of the old. Christ does not wipe out the past. He redeems it. And so I would like to leave you with some questions to ponder. What might it look like to connect with this place, Wheaton, Illinois, this land, this earth, in ways that count the cost and infuse it with our everyday lives? In what ways can we both love our neighbor and welcome the stranger better? What might our public buildings, commercial real estate, places of worship, homes, and lawns look like if we adapted our vision to the land instead of adapting the land to our vision? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a time for question and answer. And so if both our lecturer, Professor Milliner, and our respondent.
People from the art department, we're actually on time.
There's still time to fix that.
Thanks for coming. If you gotta go, we understand.
I'm supposed to use this mic over here.
Perfect. Oh, there we go. Thanks for coming, Jay.
Thank you.
Some of the people who may be in the overflow room, you might be able to come now. There are empty seats as this class has to leave the room. As you ask your questions, be sure to wait until I give you the microphone because we are filming this whole event and we want to make sure that your questions, which I'm sure will elicit fantastic responses, are part of the whole taping. So, is there someone who would like to start us off?
Thank you both. That was great. Dr. Hooker, what do you do with the tennis balls after you serve them?
I hope you don't leave them there.
No, I didn't. I take them all. I actually, so it's working okay? I actually have kept them all. And I've explored some different ways to do it. One of the things that I did for Art Prize in Grand Rapids is I showed the clips and then I used the balls to create miniature mounds that were mounds of tennis balls.
Oh, wow.
with the clips. So.
Can I real quick push you on that? because you say that that is a orange gesture, but I was spying on you and Elaine at church, and I could have sworn that I saw your hands go up too. You are not a person that just does gestures like that for sport purposes. You do gestures like that in places of Christian worship. And I couldn't help but think of the service project. There's more to your response to these mounds, and there's something about worshiping as Christians near them that I think both of us have been. Is it possible to find a connection to them in a different way? So that's my initial response to your suggestion there. Your hands do all kinds of things, and one of them is to lift them up during the Hosanna, not just tennis. So, anyway.
Any other questions?
Quick question, just for information. So, I've spent a lot of my life in Guatemala, and so we have mounds.
Yeah.
But underneath them actually are structures. So are these burial mounds that theoretically underneath are just full of bones, or is there some kind of architectural structures underneath the mounds, or a combination?
It depends on the mound. In the case of the Winfield mounds, no structures underneath. There were human remains there. Wheaton did not touch them. They were gone because the University of Chicago discovered in the 1930s, this is before the laws were enacted that we have today, called NAGPRA, Native American Grave and Repatriation Act. So when they did that dig, they found a burial bundle and it dissolved. So it is lost. So we know there were human burials at Winfield mounds that are there no longer. And we do not hold human remains at Wheaton College. We have some of the artifacts that were found that have been carefully cataloged, and they were loaned to this person doing the thesis. So that's a really important question. A lot of misinformation and accusations are thrown around about these things, and so part of this project was digging and getting to the bottom and talking to the latest experts on this area. So again, that answers the question. In regard to places like Cahokia, a lot of these are built on earth, just bucket by bucket. That's what's extraordinary about them. This is really important to get those facts straight, so thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Well, here.
No, I'm sorry, Monica, go ahead, and then we'll go to Rich.
I just wanted to point out, I thought that there was some similarities between what Chesterton did. Even when in the Middle Ages they converted most of Ireland, they took a lot of those traditions of the indigenous people, like the carvings and the whorls, and they made it part of the crosses. The clover, which was a representation of the Holy Trinity. So how much do you think that layering or connecting with place and time influenced Chesterton in his writing?
It's a great question. Monica, he sees it in Rome, so in his face, and it was there in England in a not so aggressive and obvious way. And so I think in some senses Rome opened the principle, and that principle that is cited by Augustine, that all the cultures were anticipating this, that's cited by Chesterton as well, that's cited by Peter Powell, I think that responsibly undertaken is the story of human culture. All of these different anticipations fulfilled in the universal Lord who contains all ethnicities within his risen body. And what's so interesting about this place, it's most concealed of all. Famous example. This blew my mind. Does anyone know of Holy Hill? Massive, beautiful Catholic shrine in Wisconsin on a hill. It's unbelievable to walk up. It's quite a chore. There's elevators to help people make their pilgrimage there. And I had always thought like place like Cholula is in Mesoamerica. There you have a pagan site with a church slapped on top. And you can go down and you can see the original pagan site, and Catholicism supplants it in a way. Well, that's what they do down there. Holy Hill is a burial mound, and we slapped a Catholic church on top of it. And when you go there, you're completely devoid of any acknowledgement of that reality. And it would only improve it. It would only make it more exciting to put those connections into conversation, but none of the pilgrims to that church in Wisconsin would ever, if they hadn't done the research, have any acknowledgement of that. And so, and even when you go to the Southwest, when you go to Tucson, outside the White Dove of the Desert, there's a famous and important Catholic church there that you walk inside and you see a creation myth of the natives placed on the altar, on the most sacred place, right there to say that we're in continuity and conversation with those who came before. So I think you're pointing out Chesterton sees it, he wants more of it in England, and we need a lot more of it here.
Matt, I always struggle with the differences between inclusion and uniqueness.
Huh.
And so tonight I hear a lecture about inclusion, about the commonality of humanity, about culture, about humanness. But I also know in the Old Testament and New Testament there's distinctions.
Yes.
How do you work with that commonality, but also with the distinctions, especially in light of the way today we want to harmonize?
And Rich, that's the gift of Chesterton. He says it so clearly. The gift was different than the anticipation. He clearly has that line. I think we have to be careful not to blur it. The only reason that I, with any confidence, can talk positively about native cultures that came before is because of what has been revealed to us in Christ. That's what enables the light to be shined, in my opinion. And so there's a sense in which I want to hold on to that line, and if you felt like it was starting to dissolve in this, I need to refine it. I want to make sure that line is clear. Chesterton's clear about it, and I think Father Peter Powell is too. This man, he is a holy person, and he is so deeply enmeshed in native culture, and the more he got enmeshed, the more his love of Christ expanded. And to be in the room with him and get a sense of who he is, I'm realizing it's possible to be 100% devoted to this culture and 100% devoted to Christ. But I'm an infant in that, and he's experienced.
You had a good overhead picture of the mounds. I'm wondering, are those three mounds positioned as are the pyramids of Egypt to depict a constellation like the three stars of Orion?
Do you know?
I don't know. To my knowledge, no. But I'm, yeah.
There's nothing of that in the latest study. It wouldn't surprise me, though. There are some new research on the mounds going on that's trying to make some of those constellation connections. And when I think of those constellation connections, I think, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, an attempt to bring the sky in touch with the earth. That's what we saw with the cosmic tree in the last lecture. The sacral axis of this land before Christ was understood that unified the upper and lower world. And of course you want to bring the sky into that too. But so few of us spend time looking up at the sky, and that we lose those connections. Yeah.
That's part of the connection to place, right?
Right.
Is that we don't really have so much anymore.
So we go up to Honey Rock and oh, look at that!
Oh,
Wow.
there's stars.
Oh my goodness, right? Yeah. So and that's what Pokagon sees in that speech. That speech is so readable. One sitting. The PDF, it's the Smithsonian website. You can flip through the birch bark yourself. You can hear from him, his forecast of what's coming that we're experiencing right now.
Matt and David, that was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I'm glad I was here. I have a question that is a test of your pedagogical imaginations. So, and I know you're both master teachers. As I hear your talk, and I hear the call to be more aware of and connected to our place, I hear it in a location that is institutionally somewhat disconnecting. That is, higher education has a pattern of dislocating people from their communities, from their trajectories, from their families. And there's much to celebrate about what we do, but there's a tension there between that pattern and what you're calling us to. So how do we as a college that participates in that dislocating pattern lean into that to which you've called us? What would it look like, for example, at a freshman orientation to get people thinking the right way and then carry them through 4 years of connecting with the land?
Wow.
Oh no, you're gonna. That was actually my first question for you that I didn't. And I wrote down related to Chesterton as a localist. Yeah. Sorry, I'll use my mic. Yeah. So there's also, I think, part of a sort of double difficulty there is that the 4 years of college come at a time in which, like, everything's in transition, and how beneficial is it for people to absolutely try to, while everything else in their life is maybe it's great to have that as a route, but also that's a tricky one. Yeah, I would love to sense, one of the things that I know that Matt does so well is taking students into Chicago and talking to them about the architecture. Like the moment you step off the train in Ogilvy, you're pointing out things about what was right there. What is the history of this building right here? And I think just some sense of that, I would think, is kind of just, the sense like, hey, we take students, one of my favorite things that I do in part of my teaching is we in the department have a class where we take 2 classes, we put them together to talk about earthworks. We talk about the mounds and the culture and the forest preserve, and we actually we have people write up proposals about how they might want to engage with that place, and then we load them into vans, and whatever day it is, 6 a.m, you go out and you actually work with the land until noon. And, we've done it in snow and rain and sun, but there's an attempt there to, at least for a moment, to try to get students out of the classroom into the place, feeling it in their bodies. And I think that's, maybe more of that. Yeah, what do you say?
Well, and the only reason that this project happened is because I'm here, and there was time set aside to understand these realities. And then over the last 7 years, it's just going to site after site after site. And I remember initially thinking, I've got to see all of Native America. And then wonderful committee reply, to whom I was asking for permission to do this, said, you know what, you need to focus more locally. And as a result, you develop some relationships with the Potawatomi. And now, this was an answer to prayer. Took a gamble. We said, look, Honey Rock is not Potawatomi. That's Ojibwa territory. And I did my best to pursue some connections there. And then all of a sudden, didn't get very far. And then all of a sudden, I got an email from a pastor in the area, Jay Moses, and said, oh yeah, my brother's Ojibwa. I've been adopted into the Bad River tribe. And he's coming to preach and wondering if you wanted to have coffee and come along. I'm like, yes. And so now we have an invitation to do a whole advanced integrative seminar there at the Bad River Reservation with a Methodist Ojibwa man who is clearly a person of deep wisdom who has pursued his ordination with great integrity and his full Ojibwa identity too. And he's saying, come on by, the elders know, we're waiting for you. The only way that's going to be something, I think, is if we stick at it for a decade. Hold me to it. I don't want it to be a one-off. It's got to be long-term, and then there's a network that people can walk into. And I thought when I first opened the Honey Rock Krauser's book, I'm like, oh, of course he's just going to go right to settlement. No, he acknowledges the Native American reality in Honey Rock from the beginning. And I'm reading that, I'm like, okay, we've got to take it further in conversation. Some of you might be asking, why don't we have a Native American respondent right now? Here's the thing. I said this to John Lau. He's the ranking Pokagon expert in the Chicago area. I said, should I stop doing this? I'm not Native at all. My ancestors fought in Indian wars. Should I stop doing this? He looked at me, he just relaxed, and he said, look, we're 1.5% of the population. We need all the help we can get. He said, do it right. Do it listening. But there was a point at which panic about that could have halted this whole project. And I realized, no, this conversation, this is not for me because I'm claiming some connection to the ethnicity. This is because of my ethnicity. I've benefited from the arrangement that we just heard about.
That's at that cost of Chicago, right? I mean, I think one of the things I think about with the cost is what has it cost us, and in what ways?
Right, exactly. That's what we want back.
Yeah.
We've paid something by not knowing these things.
Ow. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
It ended in a fight. Tell everybody. That's right.
Those relationships, that what you said, I think is so important. Though this need to establish long-term relationships is so critical.
And they're messy too. And
they're messy.
Initially, you think, oh, I'm so sorry for all my ancestors did. And then finally, I've talked to some wonderful Native friends at the North American Indigenous Institute for Theological Studies. They're like, I'm sick of these apologies. I could care less about you bringing me your church and groveling if you're not interested in a relationship with me.
Right.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
None of this grandstanding. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's not the future. The future is those long-term relationships.
I'd like to thank you for magnificent education. This was fantastic, but in particular for acknowledging the subtle and nuanced plethora of sides and the complexity of the issues. I loved the birch bark speech portion that you shared. In the 1880s, my great-grandfather was sent to Black River Falls, Wisconsin, to head up the mission, the Indian mission to the Winnebago tribe, which he led for his entire career from that point on. And his son, my grandfather's brother, took it over and led it into the 50s. And that's been a part of our family legacy ever since then. And I appreciate the acknowledgement that there were good people and there were bad people, and that, but at the same time, they were bringing the gospel to these people.
Right.
So thank you.
And let me just add there, if we want, David threw down, I was, wow, I mean, like, in regard to naming the Winfield Mounds, how would that look like? Does it mean we chain ourselves to some trees and we yell at people? I think what it would mean is, well, let's talk to the Ho-Chunk tribe, because they're the ones that other people have had conversations with, and bring them in. And bring in a historian on Winfield Scott. Tell us the complexity. And bring in more Native American participants and serious archaeologists. It's a long process of conversation is what we're talking about, not some attacking activism. And those connections that you just lifted up that go back lifetimes are something that would be invaluable in those conversations. So thank you.
Any more questions?
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the Native American presence in the city of Chicago?
Yeah.
And I mean, because my heart just really sunk when you said that organization is in his living room and he's 94 years old.
Yeah.
So if you could just expand on that, I'd like it.
The St. Augustine Indian Center, that is what is no longer necessary. The people involved in that worship at the Kateri Center, which is connected to a church downtown near in the same neighborhood, St. Benedict's. And that is still happening. The main American Indian Center of Chicago used to have a massive building. They now share a building with someone else. And I'm simply relating to you in my conversations with some of the Kateri Center members is they're disappointed. And Father Powell, again, he says, look, this is a sign of success. But I'm citing a paper that was one of the most challenging academic papers I've heard that described the process of gentrification exactly like colonialism. How did colonialism work? Terra nullius. There's nobody here. We'll just take it. Are there immigrants in this neighborhood? No, there's nobody here. We'll just take it. And when we raise the rents, they'll be moving out. And when I heard that paper, I was stunned. I'm like, oh, I thought gentrification was like, from biker bars to flower shops. Like, that's what it was. I hadn't realized this might be the same process at work. And so as a result of that, then talking to the Kateri Center natives who are veterans of this conversation, they're like, we feel pushed out. And you move to less expensive areas, perhaps, to see this continue. So there's something to be said for the fact that they don't need an Indian center to help them do the social services. That's more possible now on their own. So Father Powell's onto something there. I wouldn't deny that. But I don't want to be naive to think that we haven't seen the same process replicate itself in our lifetime. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Well, let's thank our two speakers.
Thanks a lot.